I can still clearly recall the phone call that set everything in motion. "Ms. Vance," the man said on the other end of the line, his voice serious but polite. "We found something inside your grandfather's car. I think you need to come down here." For a moment, I felt like I couldn't get my breath. That car, my grandfather Arthur's old sedan, had been gone for weeks. My father, Robert, had sold it without even mentioning it to me, acting as if 35 years of memories and family history were just junk to be cleared out. Now, someone from the car dealership was telling me there was something inside it, something Arthur himself had left behind. I didn't realize it at that moment, but that single phone call was about to unravel a whole hidden story. It would bring to light the casual betrayal, the hidden truth, and the real meaning of the principles my family seemed to have forgotten. When I was a little girl, that car felt like the center of my world. It was a steel blue 1968 sedan, the kind the Navy used to use for official business, and he kept it polished so brightly you could see your reflection in the paint. My grandfather used to drive it every Sunday after church, going slow and proud, with the U.S. Navy sticker on his bumper seeming to glint in the sunlight. "Hop in, kiddo," he'd say, giving me a wink as he opened the passenger door. I couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but he'd let me sit right up front, as if I were his co-pilot. We would just cruise along the coast road while he told me stories. He didn't talk about big dramatic battles or medals, but about the people he knew, the ones who stood watch all night through terrible storms, the ones who could fix a broken engine in the dark, the ones who never, ever left a friend behind. "Doing the right thing," he'd say, his hand resting steady on the steering wheel, "isn't about getting a pat on the back for it. It's about showing up and doing what's right, especially when nobody is watching." That one idea stuck with me for my entire life. He served 35 years in the Navy, starting out as a mechanic's helper and working his way all the way up to Command Master Chief. He was never a wealthy man in terms of money, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that made him seem richer than anyone I knew. When he talked about his old ship, the USS Delaware, you could just see the pride shining in his eyes. When he passed away, the house felt terribly quiet, the only sounds being the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the sound of the flag being folded at his memorial. Before he was buried, he asked me to come to his bedside. His voice was getting weak, but his eyes were still perfectly clear. "Sarah," he whispered, "I don't really have much of value to leave behind, but that car, it's yours. Keep it close. One day, it might just protect you." I tried to laugh, but it came out as a sob. "Protect me, Grandpa. It's just a car." He gave a faint smile. "You'll see." He handed me a small, old-fashioned brass key. It had his initials carved into it, AMV. That was the last thing he ever gave me. The funeral was filled with sailors, Marines, and local veterans. They all came wearing their best uniforms, their medals and ribbons shining in the afternoon sun. When the bugler started to play taps, I felt like the entire cemetery just held its breath. My father, his only son, stood stiffly right next to me, but there wasn't a single tear in his eye. Later, as I was helping one of the honor guard fold the flag, my father muttered under his breath, "You always were his favorite." Maybe he was trying to make a joke, but something in his voice told me he was serious. I didn't say anything back. I just kept my attention on the flag, folding it corner to corner, making sure it was tight and perfect, exactly the way Arthur had taught me. After the funeral, I kept the car in the garage, exactly as my grandfather had left it. Every single weekend, I would wash it, wax it, and start the engine just to hear that low, comforting rumble. It felt like more than just a machine. It was like his heartbeat was still echoing. I ended up enlisting in the Navy myself the following year. The first time I put on my own uniform, I stood in front of that car for a long moment, feeling a connection to him. "This one's for you, Grandpa," I whispered. Whenever I came home on leave, I'd take it for a drive to the park by the coast near the lighthouse and just watch the horizon, the same way he used to. I would talk to him, telling him about my assignments, my crew, and the nights at sea when it was so dark you couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. That car was the one thing in my life that felt constant and unchanging. That is until that one day, years later, when it all fell apart. It was spring when I returned home from my latest deployment. My boots still had the faint smell of sea salt and engine oil. My hair was pulled back in a tight regulation bun, and my uniform was pressed perfectly. I drove through my old hometown expecting to feel that familiar sense of comfort, but everything felt different. My parents had remodeled the house. It had new siding, a new back patio, and even a new garage door. But when I opened that door expecting to see the familiar shine of the blue sedan waiting for me, all I saw was an empty space. There was nothing but the faint outline of old tire marks on the concrete floor. The air just rushed out of my lungs. I ran my hand across the dusty floor where the bumper should have been, whispering, "No, no, no." Then I heard my father's voice from behind me. "Oh, that old thing? I sold it." I turned around slowly. He was just standing there, holding a cup of coffee, looking as calm as if he'd just told me he'd mowed the lawn. "What?" I could barely get the word out. He shrugged his shoulders. "Your brother Mark needed $150,000 for his wedding. He's finally marrying into that wealthy investment. Family, you know. It's a really good move for us." I just stared at him, completely frozen. "You sold Grandpa's car, his Navy car." He took a sip of his coffee. "It was just sitting here, Sarah. You're never even home. It's time to let go of the past." I felt something inside me just crack. All those years of service, the medals, the respect he supposedly had for his father, it all meant nothing compared to his own pride and greed. My mom came to the doorway looking down at the floor. "Honey, please don't start a fight. Your father thought—" "Thought what?" I snapped, my voice shaking. "That his principles had a price tag?" My brother Mark appeared right after her, holding some paperwork for his tuxedo measurements, looking smug. "Relax, sis," he said. It's just a car." I left without saying another word. That night, I just sat in my car in the parking lot of the naval base, staring at the little brass key on my keychain. Arthur's initials, AMV, caught the dim light from the dashboard. I whispered into the quiet car. "You were right, Grandpa. You said it was supposed to protect me." But from who? 3 days later, my phone rang. "Ma'am," a man's voice said, sounding hesitant but also urgent. "This is Mr. Peters from Harborview Auto. You need to come down here. We found something inside your grandfather's car." My hand gripped the phone tightly. "What did you say?" He repeated it, speaking more slowly this time. "Your grandfather left something inside the car. I really think you need to come now." I felt my heart pound. Whatever he had left, whatever secret my father hadn't bothered to look for was waiting for me. And for the first time since Arthur's death, I felt his presence again, like he was guiding me forward. The drive to the dealership, Harborview Auto, took about 20 minutes if you took the causeway over the bay. I drove with the windows cracked open, and the February air felt cool and a little salty. It was the kind of day my grandfather would have called good driving weather. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other on that brass key on my keychain. The metal edges had worn smooth after all these years. I couldn't help but think about how many times his own hands had turned it. How many mornings he had sat in that driver's seat and watched the sun come up over the water. Harborview Auto wasn't one of the big, flashy places. It was just a modest, low-slung cinder block building with a blue awning that had faded in the sun. A string of plastic pennants hung over the lot, but most of their color was gone. A couple of fishermen in baseball caps were looking at an old pickup truck. Across the street, the local VFW hall already had the letters for its Friday fish fry slotted onto the announcement sign. It was a real local place, the kind that doesn't seem to change much. A man in a brown work jacket was waiting by the office door, checking his watch. He stood up a little straighter when he saw my uniform as I got out of my car. "Ma'am, Mr. Peters," he said, reaching out to shake my hand. His grip was firm and respectful, the way people shake hands when they were taught to care about that sort of thing. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for calling me," I said. "You mentioned you found something." He nodded and gestured for me to follow him. "We can talk in the back. You should probably know when your father brought the car in, he wasn't by himself. A younger man was with him, did most of the talking. He was in a hurry to sign the papers and even more of a hurry to leave." "My brother," I said, and the words tasted bitter. We walked past a row of used sedans and an old muscle car that had a for sale sign tucked under its windshield wiper. The service bay smelled like motor oil, old tires, and hot rubber. A radio playing softly in the corner was tuned to a classic country station. Mr. Peters led me through a door marked Storage. I put it in here as soon as I realized what we were looking at, he said. It just didn't feel right to leave it out on the main lot. He flicked on an overhead light, and there it was. My breath caught in my throat. The steel blue paint was still handsome, even under a layer of dust. The chrome trim ran in a clean line along the body. I could still see the faint outline of the Old Navy sticker where the adhesive had protected the paint from the sun all those years. Grandpa's car, my car. I took a step closer. How did you know to call me? He held up a small plastic bag. Inside it, there was an old dog tag and a small scrap of paper that had been carefully folded. Glove box, he explained. This note had your name and an extension number for the base. The dog tag was your grandfather's, AMV. I swallowed, feeling a lump form in my throat. May I? Of course. The paper had turned yellow around the edges. My name, Sarah, was written in his familiar, blocky print. It was the same way he used to label the old coffee cans in his garage. Screws, washers, fuses. On the other side of the paper were just 4 simple words. If sold, call her. It was like he was still one step ahead, looking out for me, anticipating the mess our family might make. Mr. Peters cleared his throat. There's something else. I ran the VIN to start the title transfer and it got flagged. There was an old notation on the file, estate transfer pending. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but it didn't look like it was ever properly settled. We put a hold on the delivery to the buyer until we could verify everything. That's when I looked closer and found your note. A slow, steady anger started to rise in me. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you want to shout, but the kind that makes you stand up a little straighter. They didn't even bother to check the title properly, I said, mostly to myself. They just took what wasn't theirs. I'm sorry you're having to deal with this, he said. I'm a Navy brat myself. My dad did 20 years on the Nimitz. When I saw that dog tag, I just thought, this isn't just any car. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. We walked over to the driver's side. Mr. Peters opened the door carefully, almost reverently. The inside smelled exactly like I remembered. Old vinyl and the faint, clean scent of the aftershave my grandfather used to use. Before you got here, I didn't touch anything except for the glove box, Mr. Peters said. But when we lifted the trunk mat to check for any water damage, we found a secondary panel. It's aftermarket, but it's professional work. I've seen it a few times on old agency cars or law enforcement vehicles. I thought you should be the one here when we looked inside. My heart rate jumped. Let's look. We walked around to the back of the car. Mr. Peters slid the key into the trunk lock and it turned with a soft, familiar click that sounded just like my childhood. He lifted the lid. The small trunk light flickered on and then held steady. The mat looked ordinary, and the spare tire well was underneath, just like in any car from that time. He lifted the mat carefully, revealing a hardboard panel beneath it. He tapped the board and it made a different sound, not exactly hollow, but not solid either. There, he said, pointing to 2 very small screws that were buried flush with the surface. They had been painted to match and then waxed over. Most people would never have noticed them. I reached into my pocket. My grandfather's brass key, the one he gave me, had a second thinner tooth on it, almost like it was just for decoration. I'd always assumed it was just an old-fashioned design. I lined it up with a tiny slot next to one of the screws. It fit perfectly. Mr. Peters raised his eyebrows. I turned the key, and the screw turned. Then I did the other one. The panel lifted up easily, like the cover of a photo album. Beneath it, wrapped in old-fashioned oilcloth, was a narrow, rectangular box. It was made of heavy, dark wood with dovetailed joints, the kind of thing my grandfather would have made himself on his workbench. My hands were shaking. I carefully set the box on a blanket spread across the trunk floor. Burned into the lid were 3 letters, AMV, and right beneath them, one word, honor. Would you like some privacy? Mr. Peters asked, taking a step back. No, please stay, I said. You might end up being a witness before this is all over. I worked the small clasp on the front. It was stiff from disuse, but it opened. Inside, the box was lined with velvet that had been worn smooth by time. On top of everything was a folded letter with my name on it. I recognized the paper right away. My grandfather had taken a whole stack of it from the ship's office when he retired. It was heavy cardstock with a faint anchor watermark. He only used it for things that truly mattered. Underneath the letter, tucked into fitted slots, were medals I had seen before and some I hadn't. The Good Conduct Medal, the Navy and Marine Corps, Achievement Medal, and a citation sheet I didn't recognize. There were also several individual envelopes. Inside them were handwritten thank you notes from families. For finding him a job, one read. For fixing our roof after the storm. For paying our electric bill when he was on crutches. I put my hand over my mouth. He never told me, I said. He never told anyone. The ones who do this kind of work never do, Mr. Peters said softly. They just get it done. I lifted the letter. On the outside, in that same steady, strong handwriting, it said, "Open only if the car is taken or if you forget what I taught you." For a long moment, I just stared at those words. I thought about my father holding his coffee mug, the way he'd said, "It's time to let go of the past." As if my grandfather's principles were an old coat you could just hang in a closet and forget about. I thought about my brother Mark, probably getting fitted for his tuxedo. I thought about the funeral, the folding of the flag, and the last note from the bugle hanging in the still air. I slid my thumb under the fold of the paper. It creaked as I opened it. "Before you read that," Mr. Peters said, there's one more thing. Your father signed a bill of sale, but that title, it's not clean. Unless you gave your consent, which you clearly didn't, this was probably an unauthorized transfer. We're holding delivery to the buyer. It's legally cautious, and it just feels like the right thing to do." I looked at him, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Thank you. Do you have a notary? Can we start a hold file?" "Yes," he said. "I'll go get our notary and start the paperwork. I'll take copies of whatever you need from me." He nodded and stepped out, heading back to the office. I was alone with the car, the letter, and the wooden box that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. I unfolded the page. The first line was so simple, but it broke my heart. "Kiddo, if you're reading this, it means someone forgot what matters." The room went quiet. Even the radio in the service bay seemed to have gone to a commercial. I just stood there in my service uniform, surrounded by the smell of oil and old leather, and I felt the same way I did the day I first took my oath. Small and strong, all at the same time. I read the next line, my voice barely a whisper. "Honor isn't for sale, and neither is this car." I closed my eyes. Betrayal and greed had brought me to this place. But something much deeper was about to carry me the rest of the way. Behind me, the service door creaked open. I didn't turn around. I just kept reading because I knew that whatever was coming next, lawyers, title fights, weddings built on lies, none of it could change what that letter was about to tell me. "This is your road now," the letter said. "Drive it straight." I laid my hand on the car's fender. It was cool and familiar. "Yes, Grandpa," I said. I hear you." And for the first time since I'd opened that garage door to find an empty space, I felt a little less alone. The letter was trembling in my hands. My grandfather's handwriting wasn't fancy, but it was unmistakable. Strong, straight, and completely unpretentious, just like the man himself. That first sentence seemed to reach right out from the past and grab me by the shoulders. If you're reading this, it means someone in this family forgot what it means to earn something. I sat down on a nearby crate, the wooden box still open beside me, and just let his words sink in. The room smelled like dust and oil. Every little sound, like the ticking of a clock on the far wall or the faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead, felt amplified. "Don't get angry, kiddo," the letter went on. "Anger burns fast, and it can blind good people. Doing the right thing doesn't mean you have to shout. It just has to endure." My throat tightened. I remembered him saying something very similar when I was about 14. I'd gotten suspended from school for punching a kid who made fun of his Navy tattoo. He hadn't yelled at me. He just made me scrub the car that afternoon until it gleamed. "You don't prove someone wrong by yelling at them," he'd said. You prove them wrong by who you become. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. If this car ever leaves your hands without your permission, check under the driver's seat. What you find there will show you why I trusted you with it. I froze. Under the seat. I knelt down beside the open driver's door. The seat rails were stiff with age, but when I reached my hand underneath, my fingers brushed against something metallic. It was a thin latch. I pulled it. The entire seat slid forward with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow gap in the floorboard and a small tin box that had been taped to the floor. It wasn't very big, about the size of an old lunchbox, but my heart was pounding as if I were disarming a bomb. I peeled the tape away as carefully as I could. Inside, there were 3 things. The first was a USB flash drive sealed in a little plastic sleeve. The second was a folded envelope officially stamped Department of the Navy, restricted. The third was a photograph. It was an old black and white photo showing my grandfather in his formal dress white uniform, standing with a group of sailors next to a hospital ship. His hand was resting on the shoulder of a much younger man, my father. Both of them were smiling, both looking proud. It was from a time long before all the bitterness had set in. Tucked behind the photo was a yellowed identification card. In my grandfather's handwriting, it read, Property of the Naval Relief Fund, Command Oversight Unit, retired. I didn't fully understand what it all meant, but one thing was becoming very clear. My grandfather hadn't just been a mechanic and a mentor, he'd been part of something much bigger, a quiet network of veterans who continued to help others long after they had hung up their own uniforms, the flash drive. Weighed almost nothing, but it felt incredibly heavy in my palm. I slipped it into my jacket pocket just as Mr. Peters came back into the storage room, holding a small stack of paperwork. He stopped when he saw the open box on the trunk and the tin I was holding in my hand. Ma'am, is that what I think it is? I'm not sure, I said honestly. But I think it's what he wanted me to find. Mr. Peters nodded slowly. Would you like to sit in the office? I can make us some coffee and you can figure out what to do next. I followed him back to the front office, still clutching the envelope and the flash drive. A pot of coffee that looked like it had been sitting for hours was on a hot plate near the counter. He poured 2 cups and slid one across the desk toward me. The coffee tasted awful, but it helped ground me. Your father came in here twice, Mr. Peters said, looking down at the file he'd started. The first time was to ask what he could get for a vintage Navy vehicle. The second time was to negotiate a rush sale. He didn't even want to wait for an inspection. The buyer was supposed to wire the funds today, but we froze the transaction as soon as the title looked messy. Who was the buyer, I asked. He glanced down at the paper. A private collector over in Jacksonville. An ex-defense contractor, apparently big on military memorabilia. He paid cash up front. I nodded, trying to swallow the disgust that was building in my chest. That sounds about right. Mr. Peters leaned forward. Ma'am, I don't know what's on that flash drive, but if it's official Navy property, I'd strongly advise you to bring it to the proper authorities. Maybe someone at the base. I will, I said. But first, I need to read the rest of this letter. He nodded, understanding, and stepped out of the office, closing the door softly behind him to give me some privacy. I unfolded the last page of my grandfather's letter. His words grew a little shakier toward the end, as if he'd been very tired when he wrote it, but his message was crystal clear. If your father ever forgets what honor is, remind him, not with anger, but with the truth. The Navy didn't just give me a paycheck. It gave me a purpose. Inside that car are the records of men and women I helped after the storms, after the wars, after the world stopped calling them heroes. Some of those debts were repaid and some never will be, but those files belong to you now. Protect them. I pressed the page to my chest. This was never about money. It was about a legacy. His legacy. My father had sold off something sacred, thinking it was just a piece of metal and paint, but what he'd really sold was a piece of the man who had built our family's name. I thought about calling him right then and there, but the fury was still too raw. I knew I would only end up saying things I couldn't take back. Instead, I drove straight to the naval base. The drive across the bridge was silent, except for the low hum of my tires on the Sente. Concrete. The harbor was shimmering with sunlight. Every ship I passed, anchored and gray, felt like a reminder that some things are worth standing up for, even when it's hard. At the base gate, the guard recognized me and waved me through. I parked near the administration building and carried the tin box and the letter inside. Because the items were marked Restricted and Naval Relief Fund, I was directed to the county's Veterans Archive, which handled historical records. I met with a woman named Ms. Evans. She was about my age, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a steady, calm demeanor. When I explained what had happened, the car, the sale, the hidden compartments, she listened patiently without interrupting me once. Finally, she said, "If these documents are genuine relief fund records, they could be historically significant. Some of these post-retirement programs were unofficial. Your grandfather could have been safeguarding sensitive information, like the names of families." "What do I do?" I asked. "Let's verify the files first," she said, carefully sliding the flash drive into a secure government computer. After a moment, lines of data and scanned documents filled the screen. There were old Navy memos, scanned letters, financial logs, and notes written by hand. Paid rent for Sergeant M, 1977. Arranged job for Leon R. Send funds to widow. Confirm receipt. Ms. Evans looked up from the screen. "Your grandfather was running a relief channel. It was unofficial, but it was highly organized. It wasn't about money for himself. This was all donations, all service." I smiled, even though I could feel tears welling up. "That's him," she nodded. "You should know this makes the car itself part of a historical record. The Navy, or at least a historical division, would have reason to reclaim it or preserve it properly. You might be entitled to restitution, depending on how the sale went down." I shook my head. "I don't want restitution. I just want to make this right." Ms. Evans smiled faintly. "You sound just like him." When I drove back to my parents' house that evening, the sky was a beautiful mix of orange and pink over the bay. The wind coming off the water felt warmer somehow. I parked on the street outside the house, my headlights cutting across the newly landscaped yard. Through the front window, I could see my dad laughing with my brother Mark. They were probably discussing wedding plans or the real estate deals my father was so proud of. For a moment, I thought about marching right in there and confronting him, but my grandfather's voice echoed in my head, "Honor doesn't shout, it endures." So I just turned off the engine and sat there in the silence, gripping the brass key. The fight was definitely coming, but it wouldn't be tonight. It wouldn't be in anger. I looked at the envelope again, the one marked Department of the Navy Restricted. Tomorrow, I would open it with Ms. Evans present. Tomorrow, I'd make sure the right people knew what my grandfather had really done. And when I did, I'd also make sure the world knew who had tried to sell his legacy for a price tag. The night breeze carried the smell of salt and honeysuckle. Somewhere nearby, a flag on someone's front porch flapped softly in the wind. "Rest easy, Grandpa," I whispered. "I'm not done yet." The next morning, I didn't go into my office on base. I did, however, put on my uniform. There was just something about wearing it. The precision of the creases, the familiar weight, the quiet dignity that made me feel grounded. My grandfather always used to say, a uniform doesn't make a person honorable, but it sure does remind them of the promise they made to be." The folded letter and the envelope marked Department of the Navy Restricted were sitting on my kitchen table. The sun coming through the window made the gold trim on my rank insignia gleam. I took a deep breath and carefully opened the restricted envelope. Inside was another letter. This one was typed on official, heavy Navy stationery and was dated 1989. The very first line froze me in place. "This document confirms that Command Master Chief Arthur M. Vance has been authorized to maintain custody of the Navy Relief Car Project, a confidential civilian assistance operation supporting retired personnel and families affected by service-related hardship." I had to blink hard and read it again. Relief Car Project. As I read on, the details painted a picture I had never, ever imagined. The Navy had, at one time, approved certain trusted retired veterans to distribute aid quietly through local, unofficial channels. My grandfather had been one of them. His old blue sedan wasn't just a sentimental vehicle he was fond of. It was, quite literally, a rolling mission. He had used that car for decades to deliver checks, to give people rides to an appointment, to drop off care packages, and, according to the letter, even to deliver classified correspondence to the families of those who had been lost at sea. It was his way of staying in the service, of continuing his promise, even after he officially retired. And when the official program was eventually shut down, he just kept doing it on his own. The letter ended with an official seal and a note handwritten at the bottom. For continued use under moral discretion and personal accountability, SPTR, Naval Relief Command. I just sat there, staring at it. My hands were trembling. My grandfather's old car wasn't just his pride and joy, it was his purpose. I immediately called Ms. Evans at the Veterans Archive. I found something, I told her, my voice unsteady. Within an hour, I was sitting in her office again, with the letter and the envelope laid out on her desk. She read it twice, her eyes narrow with focus. "This is legitimate," she said finally. "I've only seen one of these before, from the Vietnam era. Your grandfather was part of a quiet relief chain. It was a kind of moral lifeline for veterans and families who were struggling. It wasn't exactly official in the way we think of it, but it wasn't illegal either. The Navy often looked the other way because men like him got results. So all this time," I said, "he wasn't just driving to check on old friends or deliver some spare parts. He was helping people." Ms. Evans nodded. "He was honoring his promise in his own way." She looked me straight in the eye. "And now someone tried to sell it off for a wedding fund." I swallowed hard. Yeah. Her tone softened just a bit. "That car is a piece of living history, Sarah. I'd recommend we transfer it to the Naval Museum or the Veterans Heritage Division. You would still have recognition rights as the family custodian." I hesitated. "Before we do that," I said, "I need to find out if anyone he helped is still around. I feel like I owe him that much." Ms. Evans smiled faintly. "I'll get you access to the legacy contact list. That flash drive you found might have the data you need." That afternoon, I went through the files on the flash drive one by one. There were scanned letters from old typewriters, lists of families, local coordinates, and small donations that he had tracked by hand. And then I found it, an old folder titled Final Route. Inside was a single address and a note, written in my grandfather's familiar hand. "Deliver the enclosed medal to Lieutenant Henderson, return my. If unable, trust to my granddaughter. She'll know what to do." I stared at the address. It was less than 20 miles away, just across the county line in a small town called Clearwater Shores. I grabbed my car keys. The drive out there felt like I was stepping back in time. The road wound through old pine trees and small farms with sunlight flickering through the branches. Every mile that passed seemed to peel back layers of anger I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The house was small and white, with a blue tin roof and an American flag hanging proudly from the porch. A wheelchair ramp led up to the front door. When I knocked, an older man answered. He had white hair and his posture was impressively straight, despite the cane he was leaning on. His eyes scanned my uniform before he even asked who I was. "Sir," I said, "are you Lieutenant Robert Henderson?" He blinked, clearly surprised. "Haven't heard anyone call me that in years." "I'm Sarah Vance. My grandfather was Arthur Vance. From the Navy Relief Car Project." For a moment, he just stared at me, then a slow, warm smile spread across his weathered face. "Artie Vance, I'll be damned." He stepped back and motioned for me to come in. Come in, come in. It's been a long, long time since someone mentioned that name." Inside, the walls were covered in photographs, pictures of ships, of crews, of medals, and of grandchildren. I handed him the small cloth-wrapped box I'd brought from the car. "He wanted you to have this," I said. Mr. Henderson opened it with fingers that trembled slightly. Inside, resting on velvet, was a Navy cross. His eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "He found this after I was injured," he whispered. "It went missing during the evacuation. I told him not to worry about it, that it was just a piece of metal. He said he'd track it down, and he did. He looked up at me, his eyes brimming. That man, he never stopped serving. We all thought he was just retired, but he was still out there, helping, fixing things, giving what he had. I owed him my life. I felt my own throat tighten. He never told me any of that. To me, he was just Grandpa, the guy who made me shine the chrome on his car until I could see my face in it. Mr. Henderson chuckled softly. That sounds exactly like him. We sat for a while, just trading stories. Before I left, he put a hand on my shoulder. You carry that same fire he did. Don't let your old man's choices take that away from you. I nodded, promising him I wouldn't. That night, I stopped by the harbor. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel. Fishing boats bobbed quietly in the dark water. I parked by the edge and opened my grandfather's letter one more time, reading it under the dim glow of the dashboard light. If they ever sell the car, don't fight them with words. Show them what it really was. Let them see what honor looks like when it drives back home. I leaned back in the seat, tears burning hot behind my eyes. He didn't want me to get revenge in the way people usually expect, by shouting or suing or punishing. He wanted me to restore the truth. The next morning, I called the Veterans Heritage Division. They agreed to authenticate the project documents, recognize my grandfather's contributions, and help me legally reclaim the car as a historical artifact. But I had one more thing to do first. I was going to make sure my father saw exactly what he had sold and exactly what he had lost. 3 days later, I drove to my brother's wedding. The guests were all shimmering in silk and tuxedos, mingling under a massive chandelier in a tent that overlooked the bay. My father was standing near the aisle, holding a glass of champagne, smiling like a man who had just secured his family's legacy. He had no idea that I had the car back. He didn't know it was parked right outside the venue, its blue paint glinting in the afternoon light. I straightened the jacket of my uniform, took a steadying breath, and stepped into the crowd. The room went silent. I walked straight toward him, the official Navy letter in my hand. Dad, I said quietly, we need to talk. He turned, his smile fading the moment he saw my uniform and the serious look on my face. What's this? It's about Grandpa's mission, I said. The one you sold for a wedding. All the noise from the celebration seemed to fade away into a single distant hum. The clinking of glasses, the light chatter, the sound of the string quartet, it all blurred into silence as my father saw me standing there in my Navy uniform. He froze right in the middle of a toast, his hand still gripping the champagne flute. The guests, looking confused, all turned to look. You could almost feel the oxygen being sucked out of the tent. I kept walking, my heels clicking against the marble floor. I was holding the envelope with the official Navy seal. Dad, I said again, my voice perfectly calm, we need to talk. He frowned, and I could see the color rising in his cheeks. This isn't the time or the place, Sarah. It's exactly the time and place, I replied. You made this whole event about family and legacy, didn't you? You wanted to show everyone what the Vance name stands for. I stopped right in front of him and held up the document so everyone could see the gold insignia. Well, let's show them. The murmuring started immediately. Whispers among the guests from the groom's new family and from a few retired officers in the crowd who had come out of respect for my grandfather. Grandpa's car, I said, my voice clear and carrying through the tent. The one you sold without asking me. It wasn't just a collectible. It was part of a confidential relief mission. For 35 years, Grandpa quietly helped veterans and their families, often out of his own pocket. That car carried letters, financial aid, and a whole lot of history. He stared at me, his expression hardening into denial. You don't know what you're talking about. That old thing was just junk. I didn't raise my voice. I just slid the letter across the table to him. This is from the Department of the Navy. It officially authorized his relief car project. Your father's name is on it, and now yours will be too, on the official record for having tried to sell protected military-affiliated property. The color drained from his face. My brother, Mark, standing beside his bride, gave a nervous laugh. Come on, sis, this is embarrassing. Let's not ruin. I turned to him slowly. Embarrassing, I said. You took $150,000 for a party and traded it for a man's entire life's work. You traded it for his principles, for the one thing Grandpa built this family on. The bride's father, a retired Air Force colonel, took a step forward. Is this true? He asked my father, his voice quiet but firm. My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the small wooden box, the one with the letters AMV, and the word honor burned into the lid. I set it gently on the table, right next to the towering wedding cake. The entire room went silent again. This, I said, was hidden inside that car. Medals, letters, and the names of all the veterans my grandfather helped. Records that prove what he stood for. You didn't just sell a car, Dad. You sold his promise. A few of the older guests nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I was saying. One of the retired sailors in the back, a man I didn't even know, stood up straight and said in a quiet but clear voice, Command Master Chief Arthur Vance, I served with that man. He was a legend. That one sentence seemed to break the spell. Every veteran who was present, and there were at least 6 of them, instinctively stood up. Some of them saluted, not me, but the box on the table. Others simply bowed their heads in respect. My father's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. He just muttered, I didn't know. I met his eyes. You never asked. The moment stretched on. For years, I had carried so much anger toward him. He was the man who belittled my own service, who called my deployments escapism, who mocked the medals I had earned because they didn't come with a pay raise. And yet, as I stood there, looking at him while he was surrounded by the very people whose respect he'd always craved, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. I thought of my grandfather's words, "Don't get angry, kiddo. Anger burns fast." So I stepped a little closer, and my voice was softer now. Dad, I'm not here to destroy you. I just want you to understand what you threw away. That car wasn't a burden. It was a bridge between who we were and who we could still be. He sank down into a nearby chair, just staring at the floor. The groom's father cleared his throat. Mr. Vance, I think we should postpone the ceremony. This isn't just a family issue anymore. It's a matter of integrity. My brother's face flushed bright red. You ruined everything, he hissed at me. No, I said quietly. I just reminded everyone what everything is supposed to mean. Afterward, I stepped outside into the evening air. The sun was just starting to set over the bay, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. The car, my grandfather's car, was waiting at the edge of the parking lot. Mr. Peters had driven it there for me after the title was officially verified. It gleamed under the fading light, looking just as proud as it had when my grandfather used to take me for those Sunday rides. I walked toward it slowly. The uniform felt heavy on my shoulders, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight. It felt like armor. Mr. Peters was standing by the hood, his hands in his pockets. Guess I missed the fireworks, he said gently. You missed the noise, I replied, Mun. Not the meaning, he smiled. Ustas, you did good, Sarah. I don't know about good, I said, but I did what he would have done. He nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket. You forgot this at the shop. It was my grandfather's dog tag. The metal was warm from his hand. I took it and slipped the chain over my neck, tucking the tag under the collar of my uniform. Looks right on you, Mr. Peters said. I leaned against the fender, just looking out at the horizon. Somewhere out there was the same ocean my grandfather had sailed, the same stars he'd navigated by. I could almost hear his voice in the wind. Keep your course steady, kiddo. Behind me, I heard footsteps. It was my father. He stopped a few paces away. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The tension between us wasn't gone, but it had changed, like metal that has been cooled after being in the fire. I read the letter, he said finally, his voice low. The one from the Navy. I should have known. I was wrong. I didn't turn to look at him. You were, I said. but I appreciate you saying it. He stepped a little closer. I don't know how to fix this. I glanced at the card. Start by remembering what it stood for. He nodded once, his eyes glistening in the dusk. He was proud of you, you know. A lump rose in my throat. He was proud of you, too. Once. He didn't argue. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, staring at the car as if it was the first time he had ever really seen it. The band inside had stopped playing. The sky was deepening from gold to violet. I opened the car door. The hinges creaked, a familiar sound that felt like an old friend clearing his throat. Want a ride? I asked quietly. My father hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I think I do. We drove along the waterfront road in silence. The hum of the old engine was the only sound between us. Streetlights flickered on, their reflections rippling in the dark water. Finally, he said, I don't deserve to be forgiven. I kept my eyes on the road. Maybe not, but Grandpa would say you should try earning it. He gave a small, broken laugh. He would, wouldn't he? We just drove until the stars came out, the old car rolling steady along the coast, carrying a restored legacy that was being reclaimed, 1 mile at a time. The next morning, sunlight spilled through my window like a quiet truce. The air was crisp, the kind of morning my grandfather would have called a clean start. I stood at the kitchen sink, my uniform jacket draped over a chair, a mug of coffee cooling between my hands. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Ms. Evans at the Veterans Archive. Paperwork confirmed, the sale was unauthorized, the vehicle's title reverts fully to you under military custodianship. Congratulations, and thank you for protecting this heritage. I read the message twice before setting the phone down, letting out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It was done. The car was legally mine again, though I no longer felt like I owned it. It felt like it belonged to something larger than me, to him, and to everyone he'd helped. Outside, the car sat in the driveway, polished, quiet, and dignified, just as it had always been under my grandfather's care. The early light caught the chrome edges, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost see him leaning against the hood, arms folded, with that familiar, half smile under his old Navy cap. Later that morning, I met Mr. Peters and Ms. Evans at the Veterans Heritage Division downtown. The building was old but beautifully kept, filled with exhibits of medals, uniforms, and faded black and white photographs. The air had that distinct scent of history, old paper, leather, and pride. We parked my grandfather's car right out front. It drew attention instantly. People walking by stopped to look, heads turning. Even the receptionist came outside with her phone, whispering, "That's gorgeous." Inside, we met with the director, Mr. Bishop. He was a tall man in his 60s who still carried himself like he was on active duty. When I showed him my grandfather's documents, the letter, the relief fund logs, the official Navy authorization, he read them all carefully, his eyes softening with recognition. Arthur Vance, he murmured. I remember that name. My own father used to talk about him, said he once helped a sailor's widow after a hurricane, paid her rent himself when her husband's benefits were delayed. I felt a swell of pride. That sounds like him. Mr. Bishop looked up at me. Sarah, I'd like to propose something. The car, the letters, the medals. They deserve to be preserved together. We can feature them in our permanent exhibit, Quiet Heroes of the Fleet. It would bear his name, and yours as the custodian. I hesitated, emotion tightening my chest. He always said that doing the right thing wasn't something you inherited. I don't want it to look like I'm taking credit for what he did. Mr. Bishop smiled. Then we'll make sure it doesn't. The plaque will read, "In memory of Command Master Chief Arthur M. Vance. Honor carried forward by those who remember." That line hit me like a wave. He'd like that, I said quietly. The paperwork took most of the day. Mr. Peters signed as a witness, his voice proud. You did right by him, Sarah, he said, shaking my hand. Not many folks would fight this hard for something they can't sell. That's what makes it worth it, I replied. When I stepped back outside, I found my father waiting near the car. He looked older than I remembered from the wedding, tired but softer somehow. There was no champagne glass, no bravado, just a man trying to make sense of what he'd lost. "I saw the news release," he said. "The museum is making it official." "They are," I said. The car goes in next week." He nodded, staring at the pavement. "Your brother is furious. He says the wedding crowd is still talking." "Let them," I said. "Sometimes shame is just a mirror that finally starts working." He gave a small, defeated laugh. "You sound just like him." "I try to." He shifted, putting his hands in his pockets. I read through that folder last night. The letters he kept. All those people he helped. I didn't know he'd done any of that. I just thought he was tinkering in the garage to stay busy." "You never asked," I said softly. He nodded. "You're right. I was too focused on being seen to notice who I'd become." There was a long silence between us, the kind that isn't empty but is heavy with everything that has gone unsaid. Finally, he looked up. "What happens to me now? Are you going to press charges?" I shook my head. "No, you'll have to live with the fact that your own daughter had to teach you what his principles meant. I think that's punishment enough." His eyes glistened. Can I come to the ceremony when they unveil it?" I studied him for a moment. Then I said, "Yes, but don't come as a guest, come as his son." The following week, the Veterans Heritage Division hosted the ceremony. Veterans in crisp uniforms lined the hall. A Navy band played softly as the car, covered by a sheet, was rolled into the exhibit space under a large banner that read, "The Navy Car Project, Honor That Never Retired." My father stood beside me, his hands clasped, looking quiet and humbled. My brother and his new wife didn't come. Maybe that was for the best. When Mr. Bishop invited me to speak, I stepped up to the podium. The folded flag from my grandfather's funeral was resting on the table beside the microphone. "My grandfather," I began, "served 35 years in the Navy, but his greatest service came after he hung up his uniform. He believed that our duty doesn't end just because the orders do. He believed that every day we live with integrity is another mission accomplished." I paused, glancing at the car as it was unveiled, gleaming under the museum lights. "He taught me that doing the right thing isn't loud. It doesn't make speeches or demand applause. It just shows up again and again, especially when nobody else will." A few of the veterans in the front row nodded. One man quietly wiped his eyes. I turned slightly toward my father. "Sometimes we forget that lesson. But the beautiful thing about those principles is that they wait. They give us the chance to find our way back." Applause rippled through the room, soft at first, then building until the sound filled every corner. When it quieted, I took the folded flag and placed it on the car's hood, smoothing it gently. For a moment, I swore I could feel his hand on mine again, guiding me, steadying me. "Welcome home, Grandpa," I whispered. After the ceremony, my father lingered beside the exhibit, his eyes fixed on the car. He ran a hand along the polished fender. "It's beautiful," he said. "It always was," I replied. He nodded, his voice barely audible. So was he. We stood there for a long time, both silent, both knowing there were no words big enough to fill what had been broken. But maybe, just maybe, the pieces had found a new place to fit. Outside, the flag above the museum caught the afternoon wind and billowed proudly. I looked up, my hand instinctively going to the dog tag around my neck. The same one he wore. The same one I would carry forward. His principles weren't something you inherited. They were something you had to renew every single day. And that day, I finally felt like the Vance name had earned its shine back. 2 weeks later, I stood at the edge of the pier just before sunrise. The sky was a soft, pale gray blue, the kind of morning my grandfather used to say meant smooth waters ahead. The museum ceremony was behind me, the car safely encased in glass. And for the first time in years, my heart felt steady. Seagulls wheeled and called out above the bay. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and something clean. Maybe it was hope. I held a small wooden box in my hands, the last of my grandfather's belongings that had been in the glove compartment. Inside was his old watch, his Navy lighter, and one final note written in that steady block handwriting. If you're reading this, kiddo, the mission's complete. Don't mourn me by standing still. Keep driving. I smiled, even as tears came to my eyes. That was just like him. No big, flowery goodbye, just a gentle nudge forward. I traced the initials on the lighter, AMV, and slipped it into my pocket. Then I reached into my uniform jacket for his dog tag, the metal cool against my skin. I pressed it to my lips, whispered, "Aye, sir," and looked out toward the horizon. Behind me, I heard footsteps crunching on the wooden boards. It was my father. He looked like he had aged aside in the past 2 weeks, not in years, but in weight. The arrogance that used to fill his every step was gone. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "You still come here this early?" he asked softly. "Always did," I said. "Grandpa and I used to sit on that bench right there and watch the carriers leave. He'd tell me that every ship had a story." My dad nodded, his eyes fixed on the water. "He used to bring me here, too. Before I started thinking money was the only story that mattered." I looked at him, then I really looked at him. The same man who had sold that car was standing here, humbled, trying to find his way back to something good. "You can't change what you did," I said. But you can decide what kind of son you're going to be from now on." He swallowed hard. I thought I knew what success was. I thought building a legacy meant building wealth. Turns out the only legacy worth anything is just being remembered for doing the right thing. I nodded. That's the one he left us. We stood there together in the quiet for a while. A fishing boat rumbled by in the channel, its horn echoing faintly across the bay. The sun finally crested the horizon, spilling light across the water, turning everything to gold. "He'd be proud of you," my dad said finally. "He'd be proud of you too," I replied, "for showing up." He managed a weak smile. "Guess I've still got a few missions left." "You do," I said. "We all do." Later that morning, I drove out to the Veterans Heritage Division one last time before I had to head back to the base. The exhibit had been completed overnight. A new plaque stood beside the car's display. The Navy Car Project, the legacy of Command Master Chief Arthur M. Vance. For those who served quietly, who gave without asking, and who reminded us that honor never retires. Below that, in smaller letters, was a quote, "Doing the right thing doesn't shout, it endures." I touched the glass and smiled. Other visitors were standing nearby, reading the description. An older couple pointed at the car, saying they remembered seeing one just like it back in the 70s. A young sailor stood quietly with his cap in his hand, his eyes misty. I watched him salute the exhibit before walking away. It felt like my grandfather's story had finally found its way home. Before leaving town, I drove down to the coast, to the same road he and I used to take every Sunday afternoon. The ocean glimmered on my right, and the pine trees leaned in from the left. It was peaceful and unhurried, just the way he loved to drive. On my passenger seat sat the small brass key he'd given me all those years ago. I set it on the dashboard and whispered, "Mission complete, Chief." I turned on the radio, and the first song that came through was an old country tune my grandfather used to hum while he was working under the hood. It made me laugh out loud. It was a soft, genuine, and free sound. I drove for miles without really thinking, just breathing, just being. The wind coming through the open window carried the smell of salt and memory. I thought about the letter I had written the night before, not for the Navy or the museum, but for myself, and maybe for the next generation. I'd told them that if they ever wondered what doing right looked like, it wasn't about medals or speeches. It was about the choices you make when no one is watching. It's about forgiving people who failed you, without letting them break your own spirit. And it's about keeping promises long after the person you made them to is gone. I had sealed the letter and tucked it inside the small wooden box with his watch and lighter. Someday, maybe a granddaughter of my own would find it. Maybe she'd understand. The next morning, I returned to the pier one last time. My dad was already there, feeding stale bread to the gulls. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. He handed me a small, faded photograph. It was my grandfather, standing by the car, smiling, with his arm around a little girl in pigtails. It was me. I found it in one of his old albums, my dad said quietly. Thought you should have it. I looked at the photo, then at him. Thank you. He smiled faintly. Guess it's time I learned to drive straight again. I laughed softly. You'll get there. We stood together, just watching the water, the wind tugging gently at our sleeves. As the sun rose higher, a calm settled over me. One I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't victory, and it wasn't revenge. It was just peace. I thought of my grandfather's words one last time. His principles didn't die when the engine stopped. They live on in those who keep driving. So I turned toward the horizon, lifted my chin, and whispered to the open water, I'll keep driving.